Zimbabwean author Tsitsi Dangarembga has been given a suspended sentence and a fine for staging an anti-government protest in July 2020.
Acclaimed Zimbabwean novelist and filmmaker Tsitsi Dangarembga was found guilty on Thursday of staging an anti-government protest.
Will affect my life.
A court in Harare handed Dangarembga and her co-accused, Julie Barnes, a 6-month suspended sentence and a fine of 70,000 Zimbabwean dollars, equivalent to $185.
I would say I'm not surprised because we are in a situation where media freedom is not encouraged.
The pair had been charged with participating in a public gathering with intent to incite public violence while breaking COVID-19 protocols after they staged a protest in July 2020. Dangarembga, a fierce critic of President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government, maintained during the trial that Zimbabweans have a right to protest.
The space for freedom of expression and freedom of the media is shrinking and is increasingly criminalized.
Dangarembga, whose novel This Mournable Body was nominated for the Booker Prize in 2020, has for years been fighting against corruption and demanding reforms. Human rights lawyers said at the time of Dangarembga's arrest that dozens of activists had been detained as security forces tried to quell anti-government protests. Rights lawyers also said there were cases of abductions and torture, which the government has denied.
Well, to tell us a little bit more about this situation in Zimbabwe, which Tsitsi Dangarembga has described as a shrinking space for expression, I'm now joined by Executive Director of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, Rosalind Hanzi. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation.
All right,
I look forward to the program.
Yeah, Tsitsi Dangarembga, I mean, it's not a huge fine, suspended sentence. Some might say that, look, she was quite lucky in what happened, but I suppose the reality is that it's a conviction, it's a criminal record, and that she was arrested, and she says that it talks about the space for freedom of expression and media freedom shrinking and increasingly criminalized. Is that something that you're seeing, particularly as defenders of human rights in the country?
Well, the proceedings from yesterday for us as human rights lawyers in Zimbabwe are a cause for concern. We have a constitution that was adopted in 2013 following a referendum, which provides for the rights to peaceful assembly and association, the right to protest and petition. And we were quite surprised yesterday by the judgment that was handed down by the magistrate sitting in Harare. And of course, as already stated, we are going to be appealing against that judgment because we believe that the right to peaceful protest is a constitutional right. And of course, of concern is that we are heading towards the 2023 elections, and has been the case over the years. The period leading up to elections, we have always witnessed violations of civil and political rights, particularly of those people who are deemed to be holding dissenting voices, or those who are deemed or perceived to be aligned to the opposition and not the ruling party. So for us, this is not really a new trend, but of concern is the fact that when this government came into power following the events of November 2017, which some have termed as a military-assisted transition, and some have termed as a coup, that was not a coup. There was talk of reforms by the current incumbent president. He did make public statements around instituting the necessary reforms to ensure that Zimbabwe becomes a more democratic state that is open to business. That was the mantra that we had for a very long time until the watershed July 2018 elections. So it's a disturbing trend, and we are quite concerned as human rights lawyers.
All right. A lot of people might not understand perhaps why, some people might be a little surprised about what she was convicted for. So I want us to take a look at the placard that she was actually holding on the day. And this doesn't look like something that would be too much for people to ask for. We want political reform. We want journalists to be freed. And when we talk about protests, this was just two women walking on the street. And this has been deemed by judges to be inciting violence. Perhaps you need to help us understand the judiciary in looking at this case and adjudicating it, how they could look at this and come up with this idea that this incites violence. Maybe we're missing something.
Well, as human rights lawyers, we do actually advocate for the tenet of rule of law and independence of the judiciary, where the laws are applied fairly, without fee and favor. But of course, of concern to us is the interpretation of the law by the judicial officers. And also our concern that sometimes some of the judicial officers may be forced to act in a certain manner because there may be certain forces that are interfering with their independence. Unfortunately, as a practicing lawyer, there's not much that I can say about the independence of the judiciary or the magistrates. But just to say that as Zimbabwe lawyers for human rights over the years, we have been calling for reforms to ensure that we have a more independent judiciary that will be seen by the public as efficient, independent, and impartial, and that will be seen to deliver the justice that the public deserves. From our position, we advocate for an independent judiciary that is able to exercise checks and balances on the other two arms of government. And of course, the ruling from yesterday is a concern, which we are going to be appealing to a higher court. And we hope that the provisions of the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights provisions, will continue to guide the interpretation of the law and also the review of the decision that was made by the lower court. So at the moment, we do have the option of going to the High Court, which is a higher court, to the court that Tsitsi Dangarembga appeared. And we do have faith that the judiciary in the higher court is going to interpret the Constitution and the laws without fear or favor.
All right. I mean, Tsitsi Dangarembga, because of who she is, she's a celebrated author. Her case is perhaps a bit more visible. There are a few other opposition MPs who are going through their challenges. But as lawyers for human rights, is this something that you see quite a lot of, particularly with cases of people that are not well known, who have no profiles, but perhaps are falling foul of the authorities?
One of the challenges that we have always highlighted for the last 2 decades, when we became active in defending human rights, has been the excessive delays in the administration of justice. And we have called for the necessary administrative reforms. But of course, of concern over the last 3 or so years has been the very long, prolonged detention of people who have not gone through trials, prolonged pre-trial detention, particularly of people who are perceived to be opposition supporters or those holding dissenting voices. We have seen this disturbing trend since the protests that occurred in January 2019, where we saw in some instances the fast-tracking of trials, and then in some instances the denial of bail for a very long time. And then we saw this trend continuing in 2020 when Hopo Chingono and the current victim that we are discussing today, one of the Triple C Citizens Coalition for Change, members of parliament, Job Sikala was also detained. They spent a very long time in pre-trial detention. And for us, we have seen that pre-trial detention is being used to punish human rights defenders or those who hold dissenting voices in cases where we definitely know that the charges that would have been placed against those who are detained are not supported by evidence beyond reasonable doubt that is required in the criminal courts. So we see it as a way to persecute and punish. When we look at the detention of these Citizens Coalition for Change members of parliament, leaders and supporters since June 2022, and we compare it to other cases of arrests that have occurred, we are extremely concerned that those who are facing more serious charges of corruption, embezzling millions of dollars, have actually been released on bail, whilst those who are facing allegations of public violence that have not been proved by a court of law beyond reasonable doubt continue to be incarcerated in detention. And we do have a constitution that guarantees the right to liberty. With Zimbabwe having ratified various human rights instruments at the African Union and the United Nations level, guaranteeing the right to liberty, the right to fair trial, and of course with those rights, there's also the right to presumption of innocence. So that is the concern that we have. And several guidelines have actually been issued at the continental level by the African Commission around the way that those who are accused of crimes should be treated and the rights that they have to be released and not necessarily be detained in detention before their trials are heard.
So, is there a fear that people have about just expressing themselves? Journalists, we almost can understand because they could be influential, but do you get a sense that people have to be careful what they say in public if it's perceived to be political or perhaps not favoured by those in charge?
Definitely, with the recent developments, particularly the case of Tsitsi Dangarembga and also the case of the opposition party supporters and their leaders who are in custody, and what has happened, it appears clear that there's a message that is being sent out in terms of what the government or those in power can potentially do to those who are holding dissenting voices and are not deemed to be politically correct. But this situation for us is not something that we deem to be an isolated event. We have seen concerted efforts by the government, particularly the two arms of government, being the executive and also the legislature, which is mainly composed of the ruling party members of parliament, to systematically close civic space. And from where I'm sitting as a human rights lawyer who is working with a not-for-profit law-based organization, we are particularly concerned by the recent moves by the government since November 5, 2021, to introduce amendments to the Private Voluntary Organizations Act, which amendments, according to our analysis, as well as 205 other civil society organizations in Zimbabwe, that also includes network organizations, is a way of government to ensure that they control civil society organizations, to make sure that they are not as independent and vibrant and exercising their watchdog role over government. So basically, the government is going to be over-regulating civil society organizations and ensuring that the registration, deregistration, and re-registration of organizations is controlled by a registrar of private voluntary organizations who is basically appointed by the executive. So we have seen the moves around regulation of civil society organizations under the guise of implementing the Financial Action Task Force recommendations as excessive and basically a strategy by the government to ensure that civil society organizations become an extension of government and they have effective control over civil society organizations. And for us, it's an existential threat to organizations like Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, that the organization has over the years been able to protect and defend human rights defenders, protect and defend rights of marginalized people, has not been something that has gone down well with the ruling party. And they've made it very clear that one of the organizations that is targeted by this bill to ensure that they are not able to continue to operate, receiving donations from the public or from outside the country is the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. So this closure of space in terms of freedom of expression, being able to speak out, is not isolated, but there's a clear trend and pattern where we are seeing the ruling party repositioning and re-strategizing ahead of 2023. And from our assessment, it's quite clear that by the time 2023 comes, the ruling party does not want too many actors to be active, holding it accountable, and making noise in terms of the violations that will be occurring in the country, particularly around electoral-related issues.
Rosalind, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us a sense of some of the things that you're seeing as human rights lawyers in Zimbabwe. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, so that's where we'll leave that story. That was the Executive Director for Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, Rosalind Hanzi, commenting on the outcome of a recent court case, but many others that they're defending in Zimbabwe in terms of what they've been describing as a shrinking space in terms of voices and freedom of expression.